Hello guys, I'm Jericho, and I'm here to talk about the digestive system. So, have you ever wondered how come the food that you eat will suddenly turn into a poop? Well, that's because it's the work of the digestive system. So, the first question is, why is the digestive system is the most diverse and complicated organ system in the body? Well, that's because the digestive system itself composed of 10 organs that contains 20 or more specialized cells that unite together to perform a single task, which is to transform the raw materials of the food into nutrients and energy which are needed to our body in order to stay alive. So, the next question is briefly explain the pathway of food from first to last step of the digestion. Well, the pathway of food always begins in your mouth. When the food enters your mouth, the chewing process begins, which combines food and your saliva into a moist lump called a bolus. And enzymes present in the saliva breaks down starch of the bolus, and then the bolus comes down into the esophagus. The esophageal tissue there senses the presence of the bolus, then triggers peristalsis, which is the series of muscular contraction that propels the bolus into the stomach. So, while in the stomach, the bolus is pounded by the stomach walls, breaking down it into the chunks. Hormones secreted by the cells in the lining triggers the release of the acid and enzyme-rich juices from the stomach walls, which is to break down the proteins from the bolus. Well, these hormones also alert the pancreas, liver, and gallbladder to produce digestive juice, and also transfers bile in order to prepare for the next stage. So after the 3 hours in the stomach, the bolus is now a frothy liquid called chyme and begins to move to the small intestine. When the chyme reaches in the duodenum, the liver then sends a bile to the gallbladder, which secretes it in the duodenum. In this process, it dissolves fat floating in the slurry of the chyme to be easily digested by pancreatic and intestinal juices. The enzyme-rich juices in the chyme breaks down into fatty acids and glycerol in order for easier absorption in the body. The enzymes also carry out the final deconstructions of proteins into amino acids and carbohydrates into glucose. This process occurs in the jejunum and ileum, which are the lower region of the small intestines that are coated by villi. The villi is responsible for molecule absorption and transference into the bloodstream. So the blood then takes the molecules to feed the body organs and tissues. And then what's left over is the fiber, water, and dead cells, which are disposed by digestion and makes it to the large intestine, which is also known as a colon. While this process occurs, the body drains out the remaining fluid through the intestinal wall, and what's left is a soft mass called a stool. After this process, the colon squeezes the stool into the rectum, where nerve senses it expanding, telling the body when to expel the waste. And after that, the stool now then exits through the anus. And so, that's the long journey of our food that experiences digestion. And so, for the next question is briefly explain the 6 major steps of digestion. The first is ingestion, which is the process of taking the food into your body by simply swallowing it or absorbing it into your mouth. And the second major step is a propulsion, which is the process of swallowing, which turns into voluntary action into involuntary action, which is the process of peristalsis. The third major step is a mechanically breakdown. It is a process where it pushes the food back and forth to keep crumbling it up by the smooth muscle segments. And the fourth is the chemical digestion. It is where the chyme turns into the most basic chemical building block by the enzymes. The fifth is the absorption. It is where the nutrients are being absorbed as they pass through the small intestines into the blood by active and passive transport. And the sixth step is the defecation. It is where the nutrients are all absorbed and left with indigestible fiber that exits through the anus. And the next question is differentiate mechanical and chemical digestion. Well, mechanical digestion involves physically turning the food into smaller pieces, which is done by chewing. Chemical digestion, on the other hand, is turning the food into the smaller nutrients, which is done by the enzymes. And the next question is, what is a coprophagia? Well, coprophagia is a scientific term for eating feces. It means eating their own poop. And the next question is, what is the definition of calorie in biology? Well, a calorie is simply the measure of energy in food. Specifically, we measure a heat needed to raise a 1 kilogram or gram in the water by 1 degree Celsius. And so the next question is briefly explain the phases of stomach regulation, which are the cephalic, gastric, and intestinal phase. Cephalic phase is ruled by the brain and happens when you think, taste, or see about the food it tells your stomach to prepare. And a gastric phase occurs when the stomach grows distended from food and stretches to stimulate the medulla and get the vagus nerves to make the stomach turn to juice, and also secretes gastrin activated from the other signals. And lastly is the intestinal phase, which speeds it up or slows it down when the stomach empties to prevent the small intestine overloaded with too much acid. And the next question is to describe these layers: mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and serosa. First is mucosa. Mucosa is a membrane lines with various cavities of the body and covers the surface of the internal organs. Submucosa is the layer of areolar connective tissues lying beneath a mucous membrane. Muscularis externa is a region of muscle in many organs vertebrate in the body, which is also adjacent to the submucosa. Serosa is the tissue of the serous membrane. And the last question is to describe the type of cell, where is it produced by, and its function. First is the parietal cell. It's an epithelial tissue which secretes hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. Next is the chief cell, which is the gastric chief cell that releases pepsinogen and chymosin. Next is the enteroendocrine cell, which are the specialized cells in the GI tract that secretes hormones that regulates processes in the body, which includes controlling the glucose level, food intake, and stomach emptying. And lastly are the G cells or gastrin cells that are a type of cell in the stomach and duodenum that secretes gastrin. And thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something about the digestive system.